Evelyn Carter stood frozen on the sidewalk, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the movers toss her belongings into the street. "Please, there must be some mistake," she implored, her voice trembling yet desperate. "I've lived here for over 40 years. The man in charge, a well-dressed bank representative named Greg Palmer, didn't even bother to lift his eyes from his clipboard. "Mrs. Carter, it's all in the paperwork," he said, his tone monotonous and devoid of emotion. "You missed a payment. We've been more than fair." He glanced at his watch, clearly eager to move on. "It's out of my hands." Evelyn's knees went weak as she looked at the pile of boxes, old photo albums, and worn furniture now strewn across the dirt. The life she and her late husband had built was reduced to a mess on the sidewalk. "But I was only late once," she whispered, her voice faltering. "I paid. I sent the check." Palmer let out a sigh, finally meeting her gaze, but there was no sympathy in his eyes. "As I said, it's done. You should have kept up." He turned away, leaving Evelyn alone, her face pale with shock, her heart breaking under the weight of what had just happened. Around her, neighbors watched from behind curtains and across the street, their faces filled with pity and discomfort. No one came to help. No one dared. Evelyn could feel the humiliation, the cold sting of being cast aside as if she didn't matter. But beneath the fear and heartbreak, something darker began to bubble within her. Anger. How could they do this to me? She followed the rules, lived a decent life, and now, with a single mistake, they had taken everything. Greg Palmer might think this was the end. But for Evelyn, this was just the beginning. He would learn that some people don't fade away quietly into the background. What happens when someone with nothing left to lose decides to fight back? Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Evelyn Carter sat in her worn armchair, a gentle sigh escaping her lips as she gazed out the window of her small home. The morning sun had just begun to peek through the trees, casting a soft, golden light over the neighborhood she had lived in for over 40 years. The laughter of children echoed down the street, a familiar melody that once filled her own home when her children were young. Now it was just her, alone in a house full of memories. Yet, despite the silence, she found comfort in her routine. Morning tea, a bit of gardening, and watching the world go by. Her home was her sanctuary, the place where she had raised her children and cared for her husband until his last breath. Every creak in the floorboards, every chip in the paint held a memory. This house was her life, her stability in a world that had moved on without her. Evelyn grew up in a different era, marked by hard work, community, and resilience. She was born in a small town in the South in the 1940s, into a family of sharecroppers. Her parents toiled in the fields, sweating under the relentless sun to support their children, despite the ever-present poverty that hung over them. Evelyn's childhood was anything but easy. As the eldest of 5 siblings, much of the responsibility fell on her. She learned early on how to cook, clean, and care for her brothers and sisters while her parents worked from dawn until dusk. But even in the struggles, there was love, strong, unbreakable bonds that kept them moving forward, no matter how little they had. Evelyn often recalled her mother's words during those tough times. "We may not have much, but what we have, we hold on tight." That lesson stayed with her through the years, shaping who she became. When she was a teenager, her family made a bold decision to move north, chasing whispers of opportunity that cities like Philadelphia and Chicago offered to Black families seeking a better life. They settled in a city that Evelyn would eventually call home for most of her life, a bustling industrial hub with a growing Black community. The transition was not easy, but the promise of stable jobs and better schools kept them hopeful. It was in this city that Evelyn learned the value of hard work. As soon as she was old enough, she found a job as a housekeeper, scrubbing floors and polishing furniture in the homes of wealthier families. She worked tirelessly, determined to contribute to her family and help them rise above poverty. But Evelyn always wanted more. She wasn't content to merely survive. She wanted to build something lasting, something of her own. It was in her 20s that Evelyn met Charles, the man who would become her husband. He was steadfast, kind, and had a laugh that could brighten even the darkest days. Charles was working at a local factory, one of the few places that offered decent wages for black men at the time. He and Evelyn shared the same dreams, to build a life, a home, and one day, a family. They married in a small church on the outskirts of town, surrounded by family and friends who applauded them, hopeful about the future. In those early years, they saved every penny they could, determined to buy a house in a quiet working-class neighborhood just outside the city center. It wasn't easy for a black couple to secure a mortgage back then, but they persisted, facing rejection after rejection until they found a small bank willing to take a chance on them. In 1972, they bought their modest two-bedroom house, a dream realized. The neighborhood was diverse, an eclectic mix of immigrants, working-class families, and retirees who had lived there for decades. It was a place where people looked out for one another, where children played in the streets until the streetlights came on, and where the local church was the center of social life. It was the kind of place Evelyn had always wished for, a community that felt like home. 4 years, Evelyn and Charles worked hard to keep that dream alive. Charles stayed at the factory, eventually becoming a foreman, while Evelyn worked as a nursing aide at a local hospital, caring for elderly patients. Together, they built a life in that house, raising 2 children who would go on to start their own families. They hosted holiday dinners, birthday parties, and summer barbecues in their small backyard, filling their home with laughter and love. The house became a symbol of their perseverance, proof that hard work and sacrifice could yield something lasting. It was where they weathered life's storms, from Charles losing his job when a factory closed to the economic crises that hit their city hard. But despite it all, they remained steadfast in that house. The neighborhood changed over the years. What had once been a refuge for the working class began to morph as developers eyed the prime location near the expanding city center. Streets grew busier, the cost of living rose, and slowly, long-time residents were being pushed out by higher property taxes and rising rents. Evelyn watched as families, just like hers, lost their homes to greedy landlords or skyrocketing costs, unable to keep up with the relentless pressure to sell. But Evelyn and Charles never wavered. They remained rooted in that house, determined to hold on to the life they had built, no matter how much the world around them changed. They were respected in the community. Charles, with his stable job and reputation as a reliable neighbor, and Evelyn, known for her warmth and care, especially for the elderly in the area. When Charles passed away suddenly from a heart attack, Evelyn felt her world crumble. But even in her sorrow, she found solace in the house they had built together. It was the last piece of him she had, a reminder of the life they had shared. The neighborhood, though different, was still her refuge, a place where the few remaining veterans waved to her from their porches, asking how she was doing. In her later years, Evelyn became a kind of matriarch in the neighborhood. Younger families came to her for advice, and she became known for her wisdom and strength. She wasn't wealthy, but people respected her for her integrity and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. "Mrs. Carter knows how to weather a storm," they would say, admiring the resilience she had shown over the years. And for a time, Evelyn believed she would live out the rest of her days in that house, in that community. She thought she had earned it. But the world had other plans. The real estate market in her area began to heat up, and developers circled like vultures. They started offering long-time homeowners substantial sums of money to sell their houses. Evelyn watched as many of her old neighbors accepted the offers, cashing out and moving to quieter suburbs or out of state. But she refused. Her house was not just a piece of property. It was her legacy, her history. It was where she had lived with Charles, where her children had taken their first steps, and where she had spent nearly 5 decades of her life. It was priceless. But despite her determination, the system was not designed to protect people like her. When the first warning letters from the bank arrived, Evelyn was confused. Then came the notice of payment overdue. She knew she had lost a payment after a particularly difficult financial month, but she had paid, hadn't she? It was a small administrative error. Nothing that couldn't be fixed with a few phone calls. At least, that's what she thought. The following months were a blur of notices, threats, and fear. The bank refused to listen to her explanations. No matter how many times she sent in the paperwork, the debt kept growing. They wore her down, piece by piece, until the final notice arrived. Foreclosure. The memory of that day, the day they took her home, brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. She had spent her entire life working to build something for herself and her family, and it was taken from her in an instant. Her identity, her dignity, her home, robbed by people who had never known what it was like to fight the way she had. As she sat in that cold shelter, Evelyn couldn't help but feel the weight of everything she had lost. But alongside the sadness and anger, something else stirred within her. A spark, small but firm, ignited inside her. They think they can just take everything from me and I'll stay quiet? They didn't know Evelyn Carter. She had faced tougher battles than this. She had worked through poverty, raised a family, and survived the loss of her husband. She would survive this too. But she wouldn't do it in silence. The thought filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. It was time to fight. And she could never forget what happened on the day of the worst humiliation of her life. There was a knock at the door. Evelyn looked at the clock, frowning. It was too early for visitors, and she wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, she rose from the chair, her bones creaking in protest as she made her way to the door. When she opened it, her heart sank. Two men stood on her porch, flanked by police officers and a court official. The lead man, dressed in a sharp suit, held a clipboard in his hand, and his expression was cold, distant. "Miss Carter?" he asked without even making eye contact. "Yes. How can I help?" Evelyn replied, her voice a little shaky, a sense of dread creeping in. The man cleared his throat. "We are here to inform you that this property now belongs to Q Bank. You are being evicted. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings." Evelyn blinked, her mind racing. "There's been a mistake. I paid for this house. I've lived here for decades." Her words tumbled out in confusion, her heart pounding in her chest. "I sent the payment. I know I sent it." The man finally looked up, his face a mask of indifference. "I'm afraid it's too late for that, ma'am. The paperwork is in order. You have been notified." Her hands trembled as she grabbed the paperwork she had kept on the dining room table. Her eyes scanned the old mortgage documents, the proof of payments made. How could this be happening? This was her home. "It must be some kind of mistake," she murmured, rifling through the papers. "I've paid everything I owe. I was only late once. But the men didn't care. They entered without waiting for her to compose herself. As the police watched from the door, the movers began dragging her belongings to the front yard. Boxes, furniture, even her late husband's old record player. Evelyn's chest tightened as she watched her life being dismantled before her eyes. Tears blurred her vision as she stepped outside, the cold morning air doing nothing to quell the burning humiliation growing inside her. Her neighbors gathered silently, some peeking through their windows, others standing across the street. She could feel their eyes on her, the pity, the curiosity. But no one stepped forward to help. "Please, this is a mistake," Evelyn shouted, her voice faltering. "This is my home. I haven't done anything wrong." The man shrugged, clearly unfeeling. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It's out of our hands now." He turned away, signaling for the others to continue their work. Evelyn stood frozen on the front lawn as her belongings were piled on the grass. Photographs, her children's baby blankets, the armchair her husband loved. Her life reduced to a mess of boxes and shattered memories. Humiliated and powerless, Evelyn felt her world collapse around her. When the sun set, she was alone on the sidewalk, sitting atop a pile of old cardboard boxes. That night, Evelyn found herself in a shelter, the only place she could go after being thrown out of her own home. The sterile smell of the shelter made her stomach churn, the fluorescent lights above casting a harsh, cold glow on the cots lined up in rows. She never imagined her life would come to this. Alone, homeless, and surrounded by strangers fighting their own battles. Evelyn sat on the edge of the cot, her hands trembling as she clutched a small bag of belongings. The weight of her reality pressed down on her, the shame of being evicted in front of her neighbors gnawing at her dignity. She felt like a failure, a burden to a society that no longer cared for her. In the morning, she tried to piece together what had happened. Somewhere along the way, a mistake was made. Perhaps she had missed a payment, but it shouldn't have ended this way. She had spent her life doing everything right, only to be cast aside as if she didn't matter. Her anger bubbled just beneath the surface. This was not merely a mistake, it was theft. They had stolen her home, her life, and no one seemed to care. Evelyn Carter stood in front of the tall, imposing glass doors of Q Bank, holding an improvised sign that read, "I want my home back." Her fingers were cold from the biting morning air, but she held the cardboard firmly, refusing to let it go. The street was bustling with people rushing to work, heads down, eyes glued to their phones, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the woman defiantly standing on the sidewalk. She had been out there for almost 2 hours, calling out to anyone at all, to listen. "This is my home," she shouted to the few who stopped to glance in her direction. "They stole my home." But her words fell on deaf ears. Passers-by avoided eye contact, some threw sympathetic looks before quickly moving on, eager to return to their routines. Others barely glanced at her, dismissing her as just another elderly woman caught in a situation beyond her control. Evelyn's breath came in short, frustrated gasps. The humiliation of standing there with the sign in hand was overwhelming. She felt invisible, just as she had felt when she was kicked out of her house. But she wouldn't stay silent. Not this time. This bank, this institution, had robbed her of the life that she and Charles had built together, and someone had to pay attention. But attention, it seemed, was the last thing anyone wanted to give her. After a while, the bank's door swung open, and a security guard in a suit stepped out. His face was stern, lips pressed together as he approached her. "Ma'am, you need to leave. You're disrupting business." Evelyn's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "Disrupting business? I'm here because your bank stole my home." Her voice wavered, but the anger behind her words was palpable. "They took everything from me." The guard gave her a patronizing look, as if she were a child who didn't understand the rules. "Ma'am, if you don't leave, I'll have no choice but to call the police." For a moment, fear washed over her. The thought of being arrested, of being dragged away from in front of the bank like a criminal, terrified her. She wasn't young anymore. She didn't have the strength to fight like she once did. But then the image of her home flashed before her, the life she had lost. What did she have to lose now? Evelyn straightened her back and held her sign higher. "Go ahead," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "Call the police. Maybe they'll listen since no one here seems to care." The guard didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked back into the bank, his movements stiff and controlled. A few minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. The sight of them sent a cold shiver down Evelyn's spine, but she refused to back down. This was her stand. The officers approached, and one of them, a tall man with a slight frown, spoke first. "Ma'am, we've received complaints that you're causing a disturbance. We need you to leave." "I'm not going anywhere," Evelyn said, her voice firm despite the anxiety rising in her throat. "I'm here because this bank evicted me. I have nowhere else to go. They took everything from me." The officer's expression softened for a moment, but his partner, a younger woman with a stern demeanor, stepped forward. We understand your situation, ma'am, but this isn't the way to handle it. You're trespassing. Evelyn shook her head, frustration and anger boiling over. Trespassing. My home was private property, and they didn't care. I paid for it, I worked for it, and they stole it from me. How is that fair? The officers exchanged looks, and the younger one sighed. If you don't leave, we'll have to arrest you. Evelyn's heart raced. Arrest. The word echoed in her mind, bringing with it a wave of fear. She imagined herself handcuffed, being dragged away in front of strangers, humiliated once again. But what choice did she have? If she left now, they would win. They would escape unscathed, and she would fade into the background, just another forgotten victim. I'm not going anywhere, she said, standing as tall as her 75-year-old frame would allow. The officers hesitated, but then the youngest one pulled the handcuffs tighter, her expression set in a grim line. I'm sorry, ma'am. You're being arrested for trespassing. As they handcuffed her hands behind her back, Evelyn felt the hot sting of tears prickling at her eyes. Not out of shame, but out of anger. Why didn't anyone care? Why was it so easy for them to ignore her pain, to take everything from her and expect her to just disappear? The officers gently guided her to the patrol car, but it didn't feel gentle. It felt like the system had its boot on her neck, pressing her into submission. The crowd of onlookers barely paid attention as she was placed in the back seat, the door slamming shut with a final, unyielding thud. Across the street, Nathaniel Brooks watched the scene unfold, his stomach twisting in knots. He had been on his way to the courthouse where he worked as a young public defender, but something in the older woman's face made him stop. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, but more than that, there was a quiet fire, a determination that compelled him to halt. Nathaniel was no stranger to injustice. Growing up in the same city where Evelyn had spent most of her life, he had seen people in his community crushed under the weight of systemic inequality time and again. His own parents had nearly lost their home during the housing crisis years ago, and he had never forgotten the fear that had settled over their household. Seeing Evelyn arrested for defending her home struck a chord with him. When the police car drove away, Nathaniel felt a wave of frustration wash over him. The woman clearly had gone through something horrific, but the system was not set up to hear voices like hers. She was just another victim on a long list of people wronged by powerful institutions. This wasn't right. Without thinking, he crossed the street and approached the bank. The security guard who had called the police was still standing by the door, watching the police car disappear into traffic. What did she do? Nathaniel asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The guard shrugged, not looking at him. She was trespassing, didn't want to leave. It's how it goes. Didn't matter that she lost her home? Nathaniel pressed, his voice growing more insistent. The guard finally glanced at him, his expression vacant. Not my problem. She should have paid her bills. Nathaniel felt a flash of anger but held back. He knew this wasn't the time or place for a confrontation. Instead, he turned and sprinted toward his office. He couldn't shake the image of that woman from his mind. She looked like someone who had fought her entire life, only to have everything ripped away in an instant. Later that day, after making a few phone calls, Nathaniel found himself standing in front of the county jail, his briefcase in hand. He had arranged to meet with Evelyn Carter, the woman from the protest. Something about her story didn't sit right with him, and as a public defender, he had a duty to help those who had been wronged. But it felt personal. When Evelyn was finally brought into the small interview room, she looked tired, worn down by the weight of her ordeal. But behind her exhaustion, Nathaniel saw the same fire he had noticed before. He offered her a small smile. Ms. Carter, my name is Nathaniel Brooks. I'm a public defender. I saw what happened to you outside the bank today, and I think I can help. Evelyn looked at him skeptically, her eyes narrowing slightly. Help me. You saw what they did to me, and you think you can help? They took my home. My home. Nathaniel nodded. I know. And I'm sorry that happened to you. But I believe there's more to this than just a missed payment. I've seen cases like this before. People being forced out of their homes for reasons that don't make sense. I want to investigate. Maybe there's a way to fight back. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She had heard promises before, people telling her that things would be okay, that everything would work out. But nothing ever changed. Could this young man really help her? Or was this just another dead end? Why? She finally asked, her voice low but sharp. Why would you want to help me? I'm just an old woman who lost everything. Nathaniel leaned forward, his gaze steady. Because you're not just an old woman. You're someone who has been wronged. And because my parents almost lost their house too. I know what it's like to think you're going to lose everything you've worked for. I can't promise that we will win, but I can promise you this. I will do everything I can to make sure they don't get away with it. Evelyn held his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time since her eviction, she felt something stir within her, a glimmer of hope. All right, she said calmly, her voice thick with emotion. Let's fight. Nathaniel sat across from Evelyn, listening intently as she recounted what had happened, about the bank, the eviction, and how she had nowhere to go. This has been happening for some time, Nathaniel said calmly after reviewing her papers. I've seen cases like yours before. It's not just you, Evelyn. There are others. This bank has a history of foreclosures like this, people losing their homes over small errors. Evelyn's eyes widened as she listened. But why? How can they escape unscathed from this? Nathaniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. They know that people like you can't fight back. Most don't have the resources, and by the time they realize what's happening, it's too late. For the first time in days, Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. Nathaniel promised to help, to investigate the bank's practices more deeply and find a way to push back. As Nathaniel began his investigation, he uncovered a pattern. The Q Bank was targeting elderly homeowners, foreclosing on properties for missed payments or administrative errors. It wasn't just an accident. It was a deliberate scheme to take homes from vulnerable people and sell them for profit. The deeper they dug, the more horrifying the truth became. At the center of it all was Robert Hale, a powerful real estate mogul with connections in high places. Hale was using the bank to evict people like Evelyn from their homes, making way for luxury developments in their neighborhoods. With Nathaniel's help, Evelyn began reaching out to others who had fallen victim to the bank. They organized small meetings in local churches, sharing their stories and building a community of resistance. Each person's story was the same: elderly homeowners, low-income families, all evicted under false pretenses, their homes sold to developers for a fraction of their worth. The group grew, their collective anger fueling a movement that refused to be silenced. For the first time in her life, Evelyn found herself at the forefront of something larger than her own struggle. She was no longer just fighting for her home. She was fighting for justice. As the movement gained traction, it caught the attention of activists and local media. But the fight wasn't easy. Robert Hale was a powerful man with deep pockets, and he wasn't about to let a group of elderly homeowners disrupt his plans. The media, heavily influenced by Hale's connections, ignored their protests. The police were sent to break up their meetings, and group members began receiving anonymous threats. One night, Evelyn returned to the shelter to find a note slipped under the door. "Stop now, or you will regret it." The threat chilled her to the bone, but it didn't deter her. If anything, it made her more determined. They wouldn't scare me into silence, she thought, gripping the note tightly in her hand. She had already lost her home. There was nothing more they could take from her. Nathaniel's investigation finally bore fruit when he gained access to confidential documents from inside the Q Bank. What he discovered was even worse than they had imagined. The bank wasn't just seizing homes. It was part of a larger plan orchestrated by Hale to clear entire neighborhoods and replace them with luxury developments. The foreclosures were deliberate, targeting low-income and elderly homeowners who were less likely to fight back. And Hale was pocketing millions in profits. With the documents in hand, Nathaniel and Evelyn knew they had the evidence needed to take down Hale. But it wouldn't be easy. Hale's team of lawyers was ready to bury the case in legal battles, and just days before the trial, Nathaniel was approached by Hale's men. They offered him a bribe, a substantial sum to walk away from the case. When Nathaniel refused, the threats began. "We'll ruin your career if you keep insisting on this," they warned him. Evelyn also received more threats. This time, her life was at risk. A brick was thrown through the window of the shelter, a warning that they were getting too close. The fear was real, but Evelyn couldn't back down now. "They want us to be afraid," she told Nathaniel, her voice steady despite the anxiety that plagued her. "But we're too far in now. We can't stop." The courtroom was packed, the tension thick in the air as the trial began. Robert Hale sat at the defense table, surrounded by his powerful attorneys, his expression one of calm confidence. He believed his wealth and connections would shield him from any repercussions. But when Evelyn took the stand, the room fell silent. Her fragile figure starkly contrasted with the powerful men seated before her, yet her voice carried the weight of everyone who had been wronged by Hale's scheme. "They took everything from me," Evelyn said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Not just my home, my memories, my dignity. And they did it without a second thought. But this isn't just about me. This is about all of us, the people they thought they could silence." Nathaniel presented the damning documents, revealing the full extent of the bank's scheme. The evidence was overwhelming, but Hale's lawyers fought back, trying to portray Evelyn and the others as irresponsible and negligent. Just when it seemed Hale might escape, a former bank employee stepped forward, revealing that Hale had attempted to bribe him to lie on the stand. That was the final nail in Hale's coffin. The judge ruled in favor of Evelyn and the other victims. Hale was convicted of fraud and corruption, and Q-Bank was ordered to return the homes to those who had been unjustly evicted. Evelyn returned home, but the world felt different now. She was no longer the same woman who used to sit quietly in her armchair, watching life go by. She had found her voice and, with it, a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. The community rallied around her, celebrating her courage and determination. She became a symbol of strength, a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. As she leaned back in her familiar armchair, gazing out the window at the neighborhood she had always known, Evelyn smiled to herself. She had fought for her home, for justice, and for the dignity of everyone who had been wronged. And in the end, she won. What about you? Would you like to hear more stories of resilience, hope, and justice? Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We have more stories that will inspire you and keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Sure. Please provide the text you would like me to translate, and I'll be happy to assist you. It seems like you haven't provided the text that needs to be translated. Please share the text you'd like me to translate, and I'll be happy to help.